Thank you for gathering your lunchbox and getting back to your seat in such an orderly manner. At this time, I'm delighted to have you see a video that has been put together and produced by several of the deacons of the South Carolina Synod as a means of introduction to this segment of our assembly. And following the video, I'll be glad to have Pastor Bullock and Dr. McCarver share with us the process that has been used in the ELCA related to the rite of ordination for deacons. So I draw your attention to the screens as you continue to have your lunch.
God calls us to join Him in the neighborhood. We each discover and are called to our own way of caring for the earth and its inhabitants. The Church has created an order for affirming particular calls to serve in the interest of that divine mission. As of January 1, 2017, those who have served on the lay rosters as associates in ministry, diaconal ministers, and deaconesses are now part of one unified roster of ministers of word and service, and are called deacons. The ministry of deacons is recognized by churches throughout history and around the world. We are parish workers, chaplains, musicians, seminary faculty, administrators, church-wide and synod leaders, and more. Whatever our particular gift or context, on the whole, those of us who bear the title or role of deacon in the ELCA carry responsibility for some form of service ministry. Some of us also proclaim the word through preaching and teaching in local settings. Many of us carry the stated responsibility to empower, equip, and encourage the whole people of God for their own daily baptismal vocation of service to the neighbor and care of creation. Deacons of the ELCA may also have responsibility and opportunity for engagement in broader ecumenical, ministerial, and ecclesial relationships. So come, meet a deacon. It's a new day for all of us in the church, as together we are sent out to the neighborhood to serve.
My name is Mandy Whitley, and I am a deacon. I have served as the Director of Youth and Children's Ministries at Trinity Greenville for 11 years. My biggest joy is watching Trinity's kids grow up and walking with them on their faith journey. My call bridges church and world by helping youth, children, and their families to connect God to their everyday lives.
My name is Andrew Moore, and I am a deacon. I serve as the minister for faith formation at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Columbia. My role is to help people live out their baptismal vocation, both in the congregation and out in the world, to understand what it means to be a baptized child of God, and that faith formation really impacts all areas of our life. My greatest joy is to help bring the Bible alive for people, for them to experience Jesus Christ in a real and meaningful way, that it makes an impact in their daily life and journey.
My name is Sarah Bowers, and I am a deacon. I serve as the volunteer coordinator at Thornwell, a ministry serving some of society's most vulnerable children and family. Through my call at Thornwell, I get to walk alongside people as they identify their God-given gifts and help them find ways to serve and learn from others in sustainable ways. As a minister of word and service, I get to be intentional about helping people find their gifts and find the ways that God is calling them into their community to serve others, to live out their faith, and to be God's hands and feet in this world.
My name is Kathleen Cartledge, and I am a deacon. I serve at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Aiken. Called to serve as a musician for the church, as a deacon, I'm aware we are all called to cross the barriers that stand between the church and its ministry in the world. In music and in worship, we are called through music to word and action. And out in the world, music opportunities build bridges that carry God's promise of hope, freedom, love, and justice. Even as we make music in our communities, singing with others and for those who cannot sing, in all places, deacons have the privilege of equipping God's children to proclaim the gospel in witness and service, connecting with other human hearts, sharing God's love and mercy as we share our sorrows and our joys.
My name is Lexanne Graves, and I am a deacon. The Holy Spirit called me through you, our South Carolina Synod, to serve as its vice president. And what brings me great joy is when I finally see we as Lutheran Christians see ourselves within an accompaniment model, congregations working alongside our South Carolina Synod, and then, of course, working alongside the church-wide expression. When we as the body of Christ work together, we can do so much in the name of Jesus than when we work alone. When we work together, we can bring clean water to Tanzania. We can bring school supplies to children in Allendale County. We can bring books into the homes of persons who can't afford them. We can read to children in schools. We can step outside of our sanctuaries, our comfort zones, and worship and bring the message of God's grace and love to those with whom we might meet in our workplaces, in our schools, dare I say, our grocery stores and our doctor's offices. We indeed are called to help those in this hurting world. And I believe in the message of Jesus that when we do this, when we work together as Lutheran Christians, and we see ourselves as friends instead of as strangers, because what connects us all is Jesus. And so when we do work together, we can bring about justice so that it can flow down like rivers, just as Jesus wants for all of us. I am grateful for this call as a deacon here in the state of South Carolina, and I am grateful for what and who we are as Lutheran Christians. Let us all work together in the name of Jesus.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming back to share your lunchtime with us. I am delighted to be here in this opportunity to talk about this ministry in this church of deacons and the entrance right that is being recommended. You've met me earlier, at least I think most of you, unless we've had some new folks who have come in. My name is Wybetta Bullock. I serve as your staff at the church-wide office in Chicago, in the office of the presiding bishop. And I'm delighted to have with me on the diocese this afternoon Dr. Susan McCarver, one of your own. I first met Susan when she was serving on the church council, got to know her there and her fine work and leadership. And then she served on the entrance right discernment group. So we are especially blessed to have her with us to be able to talk us through the process. I want to just draw your attention to the fact that there is a handout in your documents section if you go to your app, and it will give you some information and links to other information as we have this time together. So I want you to know that is there for you. And so now I want to invite Dr. McCarver to come and give us some history and a bit of introduction.
Thank you, Wybetta. One of the great joys of serving a 6-year term on the ELCA Church Council was getting to know people in Chicago who seem very far away. And it was my privilege to work with Wavetta on the council and learn so much about what she does and the great ministry she does there. I'm on the faculty at Southern Seminary. I teach church history and faith formation there. And a few years ago, I was asked if I would serve on the Word and Service Task Force. I want to give you a little bit of background about how we started and how we got to where we are today with the recommendations. If you do have if you can find the app on your mobile device and find that handout, it might be helpful as we walk through some of this. Those of you I'm sorry? I think she said it was in documents.
It's on the screen now.
Yeah.
Where to find it.
Yeah.
And I have a few paper handouts.
Okay.
Do it while you're talking.
Okay.
Let them know I can.
Those of us of a certain age can remember all the way back in 1988 when the ELCA was formed. We were formed from 3 different churches, the LCA, ALC, and AELC. In that ancient church, before 1988, there were all kinds of people who served in lay ministries, but they served with different titles. And so when the church merged in 1988, one of the questions they had to decide was, what do we do with all these wonderful lay people who serve but have different titles? When the ELCA formed, eventually they came to an understanding that there would be 3 different rosters of lay people: associates in ministry, diaconal ministers, and deaconesses. So from 1996 until 2016, just 2 or 3 years ago, we had all of these people you saw on the screen here served under different titles. They all did the same ministry. They all did the same types of ministry. They did ministry that tried to connect the church with the world in some way. Some of them, as you saw in the video, were musicians. Some of them are Christian education directors. Some of them work for nonprofit organizations. They work in all kinds of different ways. And beginning around 2007, the church began to ask, would it be more effective in their witness if we had just one roster of these persons rather than 3? So the church worked on this for quite some time and decided to recommend that those 3 groups be formed into one roster called deacon. Now, I know for those of us in the South, the term deacon makes us think of a Baptist church council member, right? But the term deacon actually has very ancient roots, all the way back to the New Testament. And it was felt that the term deacon was the most appropriate term to use for these persons. So when you see that scrolling list of all of these deacons and all the fantastic ministry they do in our synod, they are carrying on a tradition that stretches back to the pages of the New Testament itself. Now, the one question that was left open, Church-wide Assembly voted in 2016 at the last assembly to take this action. The one question that was still a little bit undecided was, how will those persons come onto the roster? When we have persons who are going to become pastors, they enter onto the roster of becoming a pastor by becoming ordained, right? We all understand that. We have a wonderful service, we lay hands on them, we say prayers, we give them charges to go and do their service. So the question was, by what right should these persons who are going to become deacons, what should be the right to install them into their office? So that question was so weighty that they decided to spin off that question for another group to examine. And a group was formed called the very unwieldy title of Entrance Right Discernment Group. We called ourselves the ERDG for short because that was just too unwieldy. But actually, it's pretty descriptive if you think about it. The question we were charged to answer was, by what right should persons enter into a roster? We were a group of people made up of all different walks of life. We didn't want to be called a task force. And then finally, the chair of the committee was very intentional about saying, we are in discernment about this. We're going to think about this, we're going to read about this, we're going to study this, and we're going to be in discernment about this. So that's where the title comes from, the Entrance Right Discernment Group. And this group was charged with, over the time, addressing three different questions. One, the one you most know about, what right should be the entrance right for the new persons coming on? The second was, what should be the signs and symbols of this office? Now, if I were to ask you, what's the sign or symbol of a pastor, what would you normally say? A stole. That's really the first thing that jumps to mind, right? So what should be the sort of symbols of office for a deacon? And the third thing was more just constitutional. The third question is much less theological than the rest of these, and that question was, in our Constitution as an ELCA, it says that we set aside, when we come to a Synod assembly, we have to have 60% lay people and 40% clergy. On all of our committees for the ELCA, we have 60% laity and 40% clergy. In what category should deacons fall? Should they be counted as clergy, or should they be counted as laypersons? Not for any other reason, but for representation on committees and as delegates to assemblies and things like that. So those were the three questions. I'm going to speak to the question, first of all, about the right. The recommendation of the group that is going to churchwide assembly in August is that ordination become the right by which deacons enter into this roster. So let me say a word about how we got there. Historically, and when I say historically as a church historian, I mean going back to the pages of the New Testament, the church has set apart people for ministry in the church. By doing so, we as Lutherans do not believe that we are conferring a higher status on anyone. I hate to tell all the clergy in the room, but we do not consider clergy to be of higher status than anyone else. I see some cheers in the back. We are all entranced into the life of the church through our baptism, right? What ordination does is it says we are setting apart certain people to do certain ministry on behalf of all of us. Luther was very clear. Martin Luther was very clear. He wanted to make a distinction between how he viewed ministry and how the Catholic Church of his day viewed ministry. In the Catholic Church, then and now, it is believed that ordination fundamentally, in a theological word, ontologically changes a person, and they are changed forever. We as Lutherans do not have that understanding. We believe that we are entrancing someone into an office to serve a particular function on behalf of all of us. That's what an entrance right is. We are entering people into a public ministry on behalf of all of us. So, of course, the first place we started to look when we started to think about this was the pages of the New Testament. And what we found in places like Acts and in Timothy and in some of Paul's letters, we see that people are set apart by the laying on of hands, by the saying of certain prayers, and by the giving of certain duties for office. So before 2016, when we had these three rosters, these three persons, three different types of rosters, were entranced into by either commissioning or consecration. So one of the things we did at an early meeting was we put side by side physically all three of those entrance rights. We put the right for ordination beside the right for consecration, beside the right for commissioning. And what was incredibly striking to us was the same thing happened in all three rites. The laying on of hands, the saying of prayers, and the sending forth into service. This very same thing that has happened since the time of the New Testament was happening in all of those current rites. As we began to hear from scholars and to do reading and to enter into discussion with our ecumenical partners and others, we discovered several things. One of them was that North American Lutherans tend to look at this differently from Lutherans elsewhere in the world. We in North America have traditionally thought about ordination as tied to being authorized to conduct the sacrament of Holy Communion. When we say someone is ordained, we automatically assume that's what they do, right? And that is what they do, but that's sort of the totality of how we think about that. What we have discovered is that in our global Lutheran community, Lutherans all over the world think about this in a broader way. They think about ordination not as some right to set persons apart to conduct communion. They think about it in terms of the term set apart for a public office. So we discovered that Lutheran churches in other countries already ordain their deacons. For example, the church in Germany, the church in Sweden, the church in Brazil, the church in Estonia, the church in Iceland, Indonesia, all of these churches already ordain their deacons because they think of this as a setting apart for ministry. We also looked at our ecumenical partners. We have 6 ecumenical partners in the ELCA. We discovered that the United Methodists, for example, ordain their deacons. The Episcopal Church ordains its deacons. The Moravian Church ordains its deacons. All of our ecumenical partners, there's not an exact correlation between what their deacons do and our deacons do. The closest are the United Methodists and the Episcopalians, but they also ordain deacons. So we started to try to broaden our perception about what ordination means. And I'll confess to you right now, when I first started serving on this, I was not inclined to use the term ordination because I had that sort of idea that ordination was something that made it possible for a person to consecrate the elements. And that's not what a deacon does, right? But as I have gone through this process, and as we have gone through this process, and have come to understand this as an entrance right onto a roster, it broadened my thinking. Now, one thing that's there are 2 things I want to say that are pretty important about this. Deacons and pastors have very different responsibilities and calls. Pastors have a call to word and sacrament. That is what pastors are called to do. They baptize, they conduct the Eucharist, they preach, they do all those kinds of things. Deacons have different responsibilities. Their responsibility is in some way to connect the church with the world. The video did a wonderful job of showing you all the different ways that can happen. So one of the questions that immediately comes up is, well, if deacons are ordained, will they be able to consecrate the elements? And the answer is no, because constitutionally and theologically, we believe that there are different types of service. Pastors will continue to consecrate the elements and do word and sacrament ministry. Deacons will continue to do word and service ministry, but that's not their call to consecrate the elements. That's not their ministry. Does that make sense? Okay. The second thing I think is important to point out is this is an entrance right. This is how you come on to a roster. So the question that arises is, will all of those deacons who are already on a roster now become ordained? And the answer to that question is no. They have already entered onto their roster. They entered onto the roster by being commissioned or by being consecrated or however they entered onto the roster. But they're already there. This recommendation, if adopted at church-wide assembly in August, will only apply to those who now enter into the roster to become deacons. Does that make sense? I see a lot of glazed faces. Okay. So I do want to emphasize those two things very importantly. One, that deacons and pastors have complementary but different ministries. And so deacons will continue to work at the intersection of church and world. Pastors will continue to do word and sacrament ministry. And secondly, that this is an entrance right by which one enters into a roster. So those who are already on the roster will not then become ordained. That's the discussion that went on behind the decision to make this recommendation. This recommendation will go to the church-wide assembly in August for the church-wide to make the final decision on. I'm going to turn it back over to Yvetta now, and she's going to talk about the other two recommendations.
Thank you, Susan. And after I do, there will be time for you to ask your questions. Hopefully we can use the floor mics for that if you've got something you need for clarification or you want further information. As Susan mentioned, the symbols for the office. As you know now, our deacons wear stoles, some of them, if they wish to, diagonally. The recommendation is that there would be the stole, that would be a symbol of the office, as well as a cross. So there would be two symbols, a stole, and we're thinking that is worn in our worship times, assembly worship, and that also that this cross, the pale pin, could be worn anywhere, anytime. So there are two symbols of the office. It was already mentioned that regarding the representation principles, now we have the clergy and lay representation. We would have rostered ministry and laity, so that the deacons would not be counted as lay. They would be counted as the rostered ministers of this church in terms of the representation principles. So we've got three recommendations going to the church-wide assembly: the recommendation on the right, the recommendation on the symbols of the office, and the representation principles. All right, I'm going to ask Susan to come back and give us just a summary and a couple of words about what the interest right discernment group thought about for the future and how this church would live out this ministry, and then we'll have time, hopefully, for a few questions and answers.
Let me just add to what Veta said about the symbols of office. The recommendation, actually, this one has already passed church council, I think. I don't think church-wide will actually vote on the one about the symbols. I don't know if any of you have seen a deacon wear a stole, but it's worn diagonally, whereas for our pastors, it's worn straight down. And as Wavetta said, that's appropriate for use in a worship setting. But we also thought it would be appropriate for deacons to have a cross to wear like a lapel pin, so that when they're doing their ministry in the world, they don't walk around the world just like pastors don't walk around the world with their stoles on. The deacons wouldn't walk around with their stoles, but the deacons would have an insignia that would mark them as, a Christian leader. So the cross was the recommendation for that. At this point, we did want to open it up for your questions. We will preface this by saying we may not have all of the answers to these questions, but we will certainly be glad to see if we can find out. So, are there questions from the floor? Yes.
Hi, I'm Ashlyn Cox from Grace and Gilbert, and I had a question about the representation as far as I understand that deacons will now be, or if it goes through, will be considered rostered ministers versus the laity. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering about that as far as electing a bishop or electing a vice president, if that...
That's a very good question. These are for representation, not for office.
Right.
And a bishop still has to be a minister of word and sacrament.
Okay.
Okay, but in terms of election to a Synod assembly or to a committee or things like that, then that applies.
Right. And I see that with Lexanne being a deacon in the vice president's office right now, what that's going to look like in the future.
That's a question I can't answer.
Okay.
Yeah, don't know that. But I know a bishop has to be on the roster of Word and Sacrament.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Christine Parham. I'm still Christine Parham, old and retired.
We all aspire to be there someday.
Yeah, thank you. Susan, if there is someone who gets on the roster, ordained to word and service, who then who feels called to be word and sacrament, do they get ordained again?
That is a really good question, which I have asked the Office of the Secretary and the Director of Worship, Kevin Strickland, and the answer is we're working on that. There's no answer for that one yet. It's an excellent question. We did not deal with that in the Entrance Right Discernment Group. That did not come up, but it is an excellent question that will have to be addressed.
I'll walk away quietly.
No, thank you for asking a question that is not yet answered.
Greg Hoffman, Grace Rock Hill, and I hope this question isn't too obscure, but in these deliberations, these discernment conversations, was there any conversation had about the possibility of ordaining, or whatever you like to say, seminary professors? If the purpose within the confessions is that, you preach, teach, administer sacraments in order that people obtain the faith, certainly seminary professors do the same, but it doesn't neatly fall within the category of deacon, nor perhaps pastor, though, of course, some may be seminary professors. And it just strikes me as odd with someone like Melanchthon in our tradition that we don't do that or offer that. I just wondered if it had come up.
Actually, it is already possible. And there are deacons who serve on faculty, seminary faculty, as well as Lutheran College faculty. Obviously, we have pastors who serve on seminary faculty. We have quite a few. In fact, the majority of seminary faculty are already pastors, right? So it's really a matter of the choice of the person if they feel that's their call. There's nothing prohibiting that. And it doesn't even take anything special. It would not take a special action of any type. They would receive, if a seminary professor or other person wanted to enter into the roster of deacon, their call would come, I believe, from the church council or from the Synod office. I can't remember, but they would have a call issued by the Synod or by the churchwide.
So they wouldn't necessarily need to be ordained to being a deacon or being a pastor outside the seminary. They could just... They
would receive a call to special service, just like people who work in a nonprofit now or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Greg Brown, soon to be at St. David, West Columbia. Question, and I know that it's kind of a legal matter with the state because they are the ones who handle marriages, but as ordained deacons, if this goes through, what will be the general practice of the church, or is it going to be one of those, let your congregation decide if you want your deacon to preside at weddings? How's that going to work?
There is a very good FAQ on that on the website, if you'll look at that. But in brief, marriage in our country is a civil action. It's not a religious action. Again, unlike the Catholic Church, for example, we don't consider it a sacrament, right? It's a civil action. So the civil laws dictate who can do that. Really, not the church. It's really the state that dictates who can do weddings. Cool. Ordinarily, a pastor would certainly be the person to still do a wedding in a Lutheran church.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
South Carolina's law, I am informed reliably, says it's a minister performs the service. What about a justice of the peace? People designated as a minister by the church, yeah. Bob?
Robert Miles, pastor St. Michael, Greenville. has the rite been written? If not, when and by whom?
The rite is being worked on even as we speak by the Office of Worship. Is that the name of the office? Director for Worship and the Office of the Secretary are working on that. And if you have any thoughts about that, you all know the Director of Worship, and that's Kevin Strickland. Everybody in the Senate has a pipeline to the Office of Worship. So if you have thoughts on that, write to Kevin. Yes.
Sister Carol Burke, St. Barnabas Charleston, parish deacon, retired. As a member of the current thriving deaconess community of the ELCA, I'm wondering where we fit into this program. We have a cross that we've had for quite some time, and just wondered, will we be able to wear both crosses?
You can if you want to, absolutely. Let me give a shout out to the ELCA deaconess community since Sister Carol has brought this up. I don't know how many of you have personally had the opportunity to know a deaconess, work with a deaconess. The deaconess community has roots that go back also to the New Testament. It's an amazing group of women who do ministry at some of the most powerful places in our society. I'm privileged to work with them in a number of different ways, and I always come away from a meeting with them in awe. The ELC deaconesses are now rostered. They're in this wonderful position of being both deacons and deaconesses because they are now on the roster of deacons, but they are a partnership group within that, or a subgroup within the deacon community. They still maintain their separate identity as a community of women in service to the church. So yes, Sister Carol, you can wear both crosses. The deaconess community, as you say, is thriving. I'm so impressed with the number of young women who are coming into this. And just so that you know the question you're all answering in your head, yes, deaconesses can be married. Most of them are.
This is Zeke Hanford, retired clergy. I may have drifted momentarily. Help me understand why those who are called deacons now and by act of consecration and whatever, why aren't they going to just be called ordained?
They won't be, because what we're talking about here is an entrance rite, a rite by which you come onto a roster, right? So you become, or you are entranced into a roster through a certain rite. In our church, for pastors, it's historically been called the rite of ordination. For others who have entered onto the lay rosters, they've entered onto the rite by consecration. Again, it's a rite by which we enter a public office. It does not confer a special, spiritual change in your character. I mean, I hope all of our pastors are spiritually changed in character, but it does not.
All the time.
Yes, all the time.
It's that work of the Holy Spirit. I guess I'll just have to think about that.
Yeah, sure.
Because it just seems like there should be some grand personing in of those people. Mm-hmm. Personing, because there's many women and some are men, yeah.
Yes.
I think they're next.
Microphone two.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Rachel Hoffman, Grace Rock Hill. When ministers of Word and Sacrament receive a call from a congregation, that's when they are then allowed to be ordained. Mm-hmm. But a number of our deacons work in places outside of congregations. So from when will their call come, mm-hmm. and when does the ordination become like, now you get to be ordained?
Good question. It would just be like right now called a special service, happens for a pastor. So a deacon who is working for, I don't know if this applies to Mitzi. It may apply to Mitzi Schaefer, who works in the Synod office. Her call comes from the Synod office, right? Mm-hmm. Those working in certain other institutions, it might come from the church-wide office. But yes, so the call for the special service would not necessarily come from a congregation. It could come from all of these different places.
Okay, so if they chose to work for a nonprofit just in the community, then perhaps the Synod would offer a call in that way?
They would have to be in conversation, obviously, with the bishop. Mm-hmm. They would have to have some connection to a congregation, but the call would come from working with the bishop and the Synod staff.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Vegan, Orangeburg Lutheran Church, Orangeburg, South Carolina. My question is similar to the microphone one. The pastor spoke a little while ago. I was following you very well. I think your presentation was excellent. I'm still extremely confused about the idea that those who somehow were consecrated deacons and are now on the roster serving as deacons, but they're not going to be ordained, or only the ones who come later are ordained. So do they continue to be deacons but rostered and still lay, or?
No. So everyone on the roster now will be a deacon. Everyone who comes onto the roster will be a deacon. The only difference is how they will come onto that roster.
No, you're still not answering my question.
I'm sorry.
The ones who were on the roster before are considered lay. After this, will they be ordained even though they didn't come in through a rite? Yep. Or are they still going to be lay?
They will be counted, the language that is being used is they will be counted as rostered leaders. So the Constitution will say we have to have 60% lay and 40% rostered leaders at any assembly or committee or organization. Does that answer the question?
Well, not really, because as another
So
questioner asked about the voting for vice president, that impacts that.
I can't answer the question about vice president. Does the bishop or Jenny, do y'all know about that? Can you say that one more time? Do you want to come to a microphone and say that, Jen? I'm sorry. I'm going to have to defer to Jenny for this one. Oh.
What we've been told from the Office of the Secretary is that once the ELCA considers this vote, should it pass for the rite of ordination, that all of the deacons would then be considered rostered and ordained. I don't know if I'm using that term correctly, but rostered, and therefore there would, because that vice president's position is a lay position, they would not be eligible for that position.
After the end of their term, their current
At the
term.
end of their term,
Right.
that's right.
So if a person is currently serving who is a deacon, they would finish out their term.
That's
and then
right.
The next election.
That's right.
Okay, does that answer that question? Okay, thank you, Jenny.
Sure.
We only have about 5 minutes, I've been told. So microphone one.
James Hendricks, Summer Memorial Lutheran Church. It seems to me when we joined, the history was that deacons had been, or whatever we called them in the previous church bodies, were considered lay. For the 30 years of the ELCA, they've been considered lay. Can you say more of the thought process about why we're no longer considering deacons lay members of our church and why they're on the roster?
I think the confusion comes between trying to put clergy and lay terms on something where we're just talking about representation constitutionally. Constitutionally, we're not going to use the terms clergy and lay. In the ELCA Constitution, we're going to talk about rostered leaders and non-rostered leaders. In no other capacity are we using those terms, just for representation. So, I just think that's the confusion. We're just talking about how are we going to elect people based on their rostered status or non-rostered status.
I understand that's how we, but I guess for the history is they have been considered lay, and now they are not. And
well,
so
part of the discussion was, and I can't remember we had lots of discussion, but part of the discussion was, if those persons were considered lay, then would that cut down on the election or service of other lay leaders, other lay people, right? And the concern was that it might. That was part of the conversation.
Okay.
Would that cut down on the participation of non-rostered people if they were in that pool?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Microphone 3.
Pastor Phil Clark, St. Mark's, Isle of Palms. I hear you speak about an entrance right, and when I was ordained, I didn't believe that I just had an entrance right. I was ordained with the purpose of serving Word and Sacrament, and I'm guess confused as you say that the deacons could be ordained. It seems that you're perhaps confusing that term, that maybe that's not the appropriate term to use for deacons. And it seems like to me that deacons have been serving in the capacity that they've been serving without any unhappiness in that term. And so you mentioned about representation of more laity, but it seems like to me then that cuts back on the representation of clergy. So can you help me to understand why there's this need to change and why you think it's okay to call it ordination and entrance rite?
I think it goes back to something I said earlier, and that is in our tradition, in the Lutheran tradition, we really believe that baptism is the way that we enter into the Christian faith and begin our service. And then we set apart certain people to do certain parts of that ministry, public ministry, whether that's sacramental ministry or service in the world. Part of the whole thinking of all of this is how can we lift up the complementary, not the same, but the complementary ministry of pastors and deacons. They both do amazing, necessary work in the world.
Right.
And it has happened sometimes that the ministry of deacons has been considered less than. That's just a fact, and that's not fair, and it's not right. And lifting up the vision to say we are all called to do work in the world through our baptism. We set apart some to do word and sacrament, some to do word and service. This lifts up all of us, I think, in our ministry into the world. And that's part of what this is not, one of the things our chair, Bill Guffian, who was Bishop of Kentucky, Indiana, Kentucky, said, this is not about just changing a constitution or changing a few procedural matters. This is about lifting up ministry for the church and the world. And that's what all of this is about.
Absolutely. We have gotten to a time where we needed to just have a break, and we want to thank Dr. McCarver and Pastor Bullock for leading us in this conversation. I'm sorry that we didn't get to the other questions. I hope that perhaps you'll take the time to ask those questions privately, and that all of you will feel enriched by the conversation, and that you will have a chance to think and process with one another over the next day and a half what you heard. Thanks so much for being with us and for your leadership here at the South Carolina Synod.